Good evening and welcome to tonight's Guardian Live event. For those of you that do use Twitter, we'd love to hear from you during and after the show. Please use hashtag Guardian Live, but do keep your phones on silent. Now, please put your hands together and give a very warm welcome to tonight's guests.
Good evening, everybody. It's so nice to be here in person as well as online. The last couple of times Mary and I have had a conversation for Guardian Live, it has been online, and I'm going to tell you a story.
Help.
The last time we did this together, Mary, you were very kindly and generously interviewing me about a book I'd written. And we were chatting, it was on Zoom, and we were chatting away right before the event was due to start, the clock was ticking down. There were a few seconds to go, and we were probably chatting a bit much. And one of the Guardian Live team said, Mary, do you mind if you could just move away slightly from the camera? Because she was doing that sort of Zoom loom thing where your face is right in the camera. And Mary moved away from the camera, revealing the fact that she was wearing a very elegant, stripy dressing gown, which she proceeded to rock throughout the entire event. Anyway.
I do want to say, I'm going to plead guilty to this. And I did kind of, my sartorial level went even lower during these kind of Zoom calls. What I found that was very useful when I did this was I always put a necklace on with the dressing gown. Because then people think, that looks like a dressing gown, but it can't, you wouldn't wear a necklace with a dressing gown. So I kind of got off.
We did actually, in the feedback, we did get people saying, am I right in thinking Mary Beard, FBA, Dane, Professor, was wearing a dressing gown? Anyway, listen, this is a prelude to welcome to this Guardian Live event. Dear audience online and wonderful audience in the room, my name's Charlotte Higgins. I'm the Chief Culture Writer at The Guardian, and it is my huge pleasure to be in conversation tonight with Mary, who is talking about her fabulous new book, Emperor of Rome. Mary is Professor, recently Emerita, recently retired from the University of Cambridge, Professor of Classics, where she spent most of her career working on all kinds of scholarly subjects, such as Greek religion, primarily as a younger scholar. But it was in the 90s and 2000s, I think, that through a kind of more public-facing turn and becoming classics editor of the Times Literary Supplement and writing essays for the London Review of Books, she started to gain a well-deserved reputation as a public intellectual. And then in 2008, I think what really changed things, Mary, was your incredible best-selling book, Pompeii, and the subsequent TV series, which really made you a household name. And from there have been many kind of extraordinary TV shows in which you have been rigorous and skeptical and scholarly, but absolutely down to earth always, and a great communicator. She presented the landmark series Civilizations, which was the sort of updating or the reworking of the classic Kenneth Clark 1960s show Civilization. And of course, she's been writing extraordinary books. Women in Power, her Feminist Manifesto was a huge bestseller this side of the Atlantic and in the US. And really superb books like SPQR, her History of Early Rome, subsequently appeared. And now this book, Emperor of Rome, which I think, again, it's a classic sort of Mary in that it sort of feels like the summation of decades and decades of really scholarly research and the kind of range of Mary's ability to use sources from the great historians to kind of tiny little shards of graffiti from visual culture is really, really remarkable. And at the same time, it's always kind of extraordinarily fluently and elegantly communicated. You always feel like you're having a conversation with Mary while you're reading this book. And it's absolutely not a trot through the emperors. Thank God. We might want to show what we're missing here.
Yeah.
It's not that.
Not them.
You will not be tested on your way out. It's really about the figure of the emperor and how this sort of figure was construed, depicted, how that being emperor worked its way out, and from enormous questions about sort of power and autocracy right down to questions about where did the emperor sleep, what did the emperor eat, how did the emperor get around the empire, and so on. And I highly recommend it. If you haven't already bought a copy, there are copies available, and Mary will be signing afterwards. But yeah, please join me in giving a big hand to Mary Beers.
And to Charlotte Higgins.
Well, no, we don't. We're not going to have to do that. Thank you. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We'll talk for about an hour, and then we will open up and make this a broad conversation with you guys here in the room and also you guys globally online. And so if you're watching online, please do start, well, you know, as the event continues, think of questions you'd like to ask, and do, you know, tap those out in the Q&A box on your screen. And if you'd like to, it's always interesting to know who you are and where in the world you're writing from. But, okay, so Mary, my first question. So we're talking, and as I said, your book is a kind of extraordinary synthesis in a way. It's about the figure of the emperor and how this figure works as a political and a social and a cultural entity. But before we get into that, I just want us to establish here, why was there an emperor at all? Okay, so why did one-man rule come about in Rome after centuries of a kind of quasi sort of democratic-ish republican system, particularly when that republican system absolutely at the heart of its ideology was this idea that we had got rid of kings. We didn't want kings, they were despotic. Yeah. So how come emperors?
I'm going to give you the short answer, you'll be pleased to know, because the long answer would take all the time we have. And I'm going to get it in two parts. I'm just going to set the chronology and then think a bit about why it's more complicated than it looks. I mean, the simple answer is that in the middle of the 1st century BC, we'll go back in a minute to what Rome was like then, after a long period of on and off civil war for almost a century, Julius Caesar effectively establishes himself at the pinnacle of the Roman political system, effectively as a one-man ruler. And he makes himself not an emperor, actually, although he's a kind of proto-emperor. He makes himself dictator forever. In response to that, Brutus and Cassius, plus a lot of their mates, assassinate him in the name of liberty. Now, just in parenthesis, I mean, Shakespeare's responsible for a lot here, and Shakespeare's responsible for us making Brutus and Cassius into rather decent heroes, when in fact they were nasty pieces of work, and were pretty inefficient assassination. Assassination itself is always easy, often easy. It's what you do next that is a problem, and they hadn't got a forward plan at all. So what follows Caesar's assassination in the name of liberty is more period of civil war, during which it becomes absolutely increasingly apparent that what Brutus and Cassius were wanting, which was apparently to get rid of one-man rule, was precisely what was going to be the outcome. So Caesar's murdered, civil war, they all fight each other in an extremely complicated way for more than 10 years. The last man standing is Caesar's great-nephew, an adopted son. Up there on the left, he's called Octavian to start with. He later becomes known as Augustus, who beats Antony and Cleopatra, 31 BC, and establishes a new form, not of dictatorship, but he would have called it a kind of first among equals regime, but at which Augustus is absolutely at the top. He controls the army, he controls force, he controls elections, and almost everything else. And that lasts, in some form or other, for the rest of Roman time. That's the kind of wiki answer to the question. I think why it's more complicated is that it's very easy to get the impression, because the language gives it to you, that it was under the Roman emperors that Rome got its empire. All right? Now, it's absolutely the reverse. During the rule of these one-man rulers, these emperors, there was very, very little increase in Roman territory. Rome acquired its land-based empire during the so-called democracy a couple of hundred years before one-man rule was on the scene. And in a way, it was acquiring that empire that produced the emperors rather than the emperors producing the empire. That's to say, Rome, in its sort of democracy form, was a very, very low-level, undeveloped kind of government, which was fine for governing a small city-state in central Italy, but actually was absolutely flawed by governing the empire that, for reasons that are very puzzling to us, it found it got. We're all very interested in why Roman Empire fell. Much more interesting is why they acquired an empire. Were they nastier than anybody else? No, probably. Were they more efficient? Well, sometimes, but not always. But for very complicated reasons, they got this empire, but they couldn't govern it with the traditional structures of government, people only holding office for 1 year at a time, never holding power on their own, always sharing it, government by committee in a kind of really extreme form. And before the proto-emperorship of Caesar, there'd been a series of people who actually had short-term taken control of, dealing with a particular dangerous enemy or whatever. And in many ways, it was the demands of governing an empire that produced an emperor, first in Caesar, really, but then in this lot, until the end of Roman time.
So we're confronted with the reality, or the proposition, I suppose, that it's actually it was an effective way of ruling an empire. I mean, the thing is, everybody always knows that the one thing we know about the Roman Empire is that it fell, right? And we're always thinking about the fall of the Roman Empire, but I suppose what we don't necessarily think about on the obverse of that is just how long it lasted, how successful it was, right? And one way of counting it is right up to the fall of Constantinople, 1453.
Yeah, that's right.
After the Roman Empire splits into two parts, Rome falls, but Constantinople merrily carries on. So arguably, it's a hugely successful form of ruling.
It's an extraordinarily successful, but puzzlingly successful institution. I mean, it's puzzling why the Romans, as I said, acquired a geographical empire. It's then puzzling why this lot, and we could put up plenty more of them, but they'd all look the same, why they survived, particularly because in many, many cases, the individual emperor's grip on power was ultimately very weak. There was rumours that Augustus had been poisoned, Nero committed suicide, Vitellius was done in, Vespasian sort of managed okay to just about die in his bed, and so forth. And again, I think often people do ask the wrong questions. Gibbon, I said Shakespeare had a lot to answer for with Julius Caesar. Well, Gibbon has got a lot to answer for with Decline and Fall. He's made that seem the question. And it is, and I treat it a bit in the book, but I don't think there's ever any answer to this. Why did it last? Given the human frailty of these guys you see up there. Now, you can point to factors, I think, which help you understand, but I don't think you can ever get it quite right. Augustus, in a sense, as the first emperor, set the template for one-man rule. And whether he actually had whether he had a master plan or not, or whether it was a series of improvisations, we simply don't know. The key thing probably, which is more than anything else, if you really want to know why was it not thrown over, is that Augustus nationalizes the army. One of the reasons that Rome has had civil war after civil war in the 100 or so years running up to this is that Roman armies in the quasi-democracy of the Republic were almost always part private armies. They might be state-funded, but they were actually under the control of individual generals and loyal to them. What Augustus does is he comes along and, he's been as guilty of having a private army as anybody has. He comes along and he says, all the soldiers are going to be loyal to the state, that is me, right? And he does that, he achieves that by, the simple mechanism of having a fixed term of military service in a volunteer army and a pension plan. Basically, that soldiers, when they retire after 16 years service, get either cash or land to keep them in their retirement. It's a monstrously expensive thing to do. It's reckoned that it cost half the revenue of the Roman Empire. It's clear that it was too expensive because by the end of the reign of Augustus, he was doing what we're currently doing, and what all governments do when they're short of the ready. He was increasing the term of service and putting off the pension payment, right? And so exactly what's happening now. It saves money brilliantly because you don't have to pay out, and some of them will be dead before you do, right? And that was Augustus's strategy. But at a certain level, you could say the Roman Empire rests on force. It rests on and it's supported by the soldiers being loyal to the emperor. And in the first couple of 100 years of the empire, of the empire in the sense of one-man rule, after all sorts of civil wars before, there's only two periods. One at the death of Nero and one later on in 192, where the armies actually step out of line. So ultimately, Augustus buys them off.
Well, Putin's discovered that it's not a great idea to have a private army floating around, and you have to nationalise them in the end. So we've got the beginning, and we've got the fact that it turned out quite a successful way of, not a very nice way of running an empire, but certainly very successful. What I really want to ask you about is how you deal with the evidence for these guys, right? Because, you know, in history generally, you're not going to be able to see what it was like through a clear pane of glass. In ancient historiography, that sort of sense of distance and distortion is increased. With ancient historiography about, you know, larger than life, all-powerful men around whom the stakes were incredibly high for everybody writing about them, or even when they were, or especially when they were writing about themselves, the distortion, or rather the agenda that everyone brings to these figures must be enormous. And so one's tempted not to believe many of the preposterous things that are written about them. Yeah. And yet, if you look at Putin, for example, right, he really does have an absolutely enormous palace, you know, with an aqua discotheque, you know, kind of,
really?
Yes, sort of insane levels of
Nero
luxury.
would have loved that.
Absolutely.
Absolutely
and
loved
he really
it.
does poison his enemies in cruel and unusual ways. Yeah. Right, so how do you kind of feel your way through the fog of the ancient world to come up with something that makes sense?
Well, that's what you struggle with, I think. And in some ways, over the course of writing this book, I kind of changed my mind about how I was going to deal with things. And that, I mean, it starts from what you're confronted by when you just start to scratch the surface of what people said in the ancient world about these emperors. And we know the kind of stuff that is most memorable, right? It is stories about what the Emperor Tiberius got up to in the swimming pool, right?
But it's all the really nasty bits from I, Claudius,
You know,
basically.
It is all, yes, that's right. I mean, to save you Googling...
Are you really going to describe that? Oh, yeah. Go on, then.
I'll do it in a very kind of old lady way. He employed young boys to come and nibble his private parts while in the water.
I believe we're talking about this.
And what did Domitian spend his spare time doing? Well, he liked to kill flies with his pen, right? What did Caligula do with his favourite horse? We all know the answer to that. He threatened to make him the consul of Rome. And here, let's go back to the very end, what did this particular specimen, the Emperor Elagabalus from the early 3rd century, what kind of things did he get up to? Well, on one occasion, immortalised by Alma Tadema, he invited his mates to dinner. He showered them with rose petals, but he was so generous that the petals smothered them and they died. Right? It's worth looking, I've got the picture in the book, it's worth looking at the faces of the people. Because if you look carefully, you'll see that some of the guests are still blissfully unaware of what's going to happen. Others have seen it isn't going to end well, and their physiognomy is quite different. So that's what makes I, Claudius interesting. That's what you get in many biographies. And I suppose I started off being a bit austere about that. And I said, look, most of those can't possibly be true, right? We know they're not true because, take Caligula and his horse. I mean, that story is told about plenty of other emperors too, not in exactly those terms, but, emperors have got very dodgy relationships with their racehorses. Right the way through.
And Hadrian, yeah.
Hadrian.
Who wrote poetry.
Blimey,
But that's true though, right?
Yes, Hadrian wrote poetry to his, Commodus had his horses painted, their toenails painted gold, that kind of stuff. And you say, when you read these anecdotes about one emperor, you think, wow, that's really, but actually, this is part of the common currency told and retold about emperors. And my first instinct was to be a kind of good old positivist Roman historian. Say, well, I'm going to get rid of those. You know, I'm not having any horses being made consuls, and certainly no rose petal showers, you know. But I realised pretty quickly that if you remove that from your account, well, A, you're not left with all that much, in part, but B, you've sort of not got the point, because the point of these stories was how they give you a sort of glimpse or put under the spotlight what Romans' fears and fantasies about their emperors were. So in some ways what I do with the anecdotes is I turn them on their head, right? And I say, I don't give a toss whether this is true, but what I do give a toss about is what it tells us about how people thought about these guys. So in the case of old Elagabalus, or young Elagabalus, because he was murdered when he was 18, so he didn't have much chance to do too much of this. What's that story about? Well, in part, it's not just about a capricious teenage emperor who kind of gets things wrong. Elagabalus also, by the way, invented the whoopee cushion, a little known invention of the Roman world, but he had his guests sat on inflatables, and he had people deflate the inflatables through the evening so they collapsed, you know. It's good old Elagabalan stories, and there's lots more. But here, underneath the colour, there's a point about the edginess and the untrustworthiness, the difficulty, the dystopia of life in the palace. You go to dinner with the emperor, and when the emperor is being most generous, he's actually murdering you. That is a theme that you can't ever trust imperial generosity, that is told on many occasions, and not often as colourfully as this. But you start, when you look at these stories, to see that they're telling you about more than you think they are. So that's, if you say, I'm interested in how they thought about them, not just in what they did, you get a different perspective. But I think the other thing that you can do is you can move a bit away from the standard ancient historians like Tacitus and Suetonius. Now, you know, if I go to a desert island, I'd probably choose Tacitus to take with me. I think he's a brilliant historian. But you can fill out the picture of what it is to be an emperor in using many, many different sources, which give you not this kind of world of bloodstained corridors of power, but they show you the emperor at his desk, the emperor doing his job, the emperor with his servants. And just about here, to get rid of the rose petals for a minute, you know, here's just one of the things that comes in the book, and it's the little tombstone of the masseurs, the slave masseurs, the unctrix of the Empress Livia. And once you start going outside the great classic historians, and you look at the tombstones, you look at other, you know, much more offbeat bits of literature, you find a vision of emperors and how the imperial palace works that you can start to construct a different kind of picture from, I think. And you don't have to go down the often terribly blokish sort of series of stories about power clashes at the top, etc., etc.
No, I like that. It's the sense that when I was talking about the sort of notional pane of glass that one might hypothetically see through to see what it was really like. Actually, accepting that there's never going to be that clear pane of glass, but actually the pane of glass with all its strange kind of patterns and distortions is worth looking at itself. You can look at the pane of glass. Yeah, and then you've got all these incredible graffitis. You get an extraordinary amount out of a little graffito of a crucifixion, I think.
Oh, right, yes. Probably the first evidence, the first surviving version of a Christian crucifixion is actually in the slave quarters on the Palatine Hill in the Imperial Palace in Rome. And it is a graffiti of a man with a donkey's head on a cross being prayed to by what is, I think, a slave in a tunic, and underneath is written in Greek, Alexamenos is worshipping his god. And there, not only do you see a bit about the slave culture in the imperial palace. You see them bantering. You see some slaves taking the piss out of another one because he's got a funny new radical cult. But you're also seeing the way religious change is happening in the circle of the emperor. But it's not actually first, that's what was amazing, happening in the head of the emperor himself. It's happening in the slave community. Yeah. It takes the Roman emperor another 100 years to think that Christianity might be worth signing up to.
Yeah.
So there are just these things that, I suppose I feel kind of that I'm liberating them a bit, because an awful lot of the best bits of evidence of life in and around the imperial palace, of what the emperor does, they've kind of been kept too close to the chests of academic historians. They haven't let them out into the world. They've encouraged people to read Tacitus and Suetonius and to do the kind of big biographies. They haven't shared some of the stuff that is absolutely the most gripping and revealing.
I mean, some of the most striking and unusual, to me, unfamiliar stuff was like Galen's doctor's notes on the actual emperor's body, and you can't, in a way, you just cannot get closer than an account of the anal suppository given to the emperor. So there are moments when you can actually get super close. It's still, it's still written with an agenda, but you get super close. Can you talk about these medical notes?
Yeah, well, Galen is. He's a sadly neglected character. He was hugely prolific. He's a doctor at the end of the 2nd century AD, CE. He is responsible, he writes in Greek, he is responsible for 10% of all surviving ancient Greek literature, right? So eat your heart out, Homer, Thucydides. Galen is 10% of the whole lot. Now,
that's a lot. There's a lot of Greek literature.
And he's a very interesting character because he's both a medical theorist, he is a celebrity dissector, and he's also treating the emperors. And I hesitate a bit because I don't want to make everybody instantly rush out to read some of the translations of Galen that there is, because these many, 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 many volumes, quite a lot are pretty hardcore medical science, right? It is whether this bit of an artery connects up with that bit of an artery, and it's not an easy read. But in all this, you find really extraordinary material. He starts his life as a doctor to gladiators, and he describes a bit of that. But the stuff in the imperial palace.
And who was he? Which emperor was he treating? Remind us.
His most famous client is Marcus Aurelius, the quotes philosopher emperor, and he describes being called into the palace late one night when Marcus has got a nasty case of a very nasty tummy bug, right? I'm not quite sure. I think it's constipation rather than diarrhea, but it's not good. And he's not getting better. And the kind of lower level doctors in the palace are treating Marcus Aurelius, and they kind of think he might not make it, right? So we've got to call in Galen, because Galen is, he's kind of a bit like Michael Mosley, but sort of even sort of higher up the celebrity stakes, And Galen comes in. Galen is actually can be a bit of a pain in the butt. He's hopelessly competitive. And he says to the other doctors, "What have you been giving him?" And they say, "Porridge," right? And he said, "What? Porridge for constipation? No wonder the guy is in such a terrible state." He dismisses the doctors. Marcus Aurelius insists that Galen takes his pulse, and this confirms somehow Galen's view that it's a very nasty case of constipation. And as Charlotte so rightly says, he prescribes a rather expensive anal suppository, which does the trick. Marcus Aurelius the next day is better. He does give an alternative version if you couldn't afford the anal suppository. So if you're reading this and you perhaps aren't that rich, and you just see him, he talks you through how he diagnosed the sick emperor's body. And it is, it is truly extraordinary.
And not necessarily what you would get if you were reading a kind of political biography of Marcus Aurelius. Just wouldn't come into it.
And I think those kind of stories have got marginalised because of the way that, we've wanted always to tell the political narrative history, when actually the truth is not much happens in the empire, really, in big political terms. It stays the same for a very long time. But if you, in a sense, invert this and you take what has been neglected and make that not the centre, but equally central in the story, you get a very different view. You also find out that emperors, Marcus Aurelius in particular, is taking a wonder prophylactic drug called theriac the whole time. And Galen,
shades of, drinking a draught of bleach for coronavirus.
Yeah. And many of them swear by it. It's got over 60 ingredients, including snake skin. It even looks as if there is a palace snake controller who often must have been, I think, producing some of the ingredients for theriac. It requires cinnamon, and Galen is very pissed off because one of Marcus Aurelius's predecessors had got rid of the cinnamon stores, and so he has to go and find some more cinnamon to make theriac. And it also includes opium. And Marcus Aurelius seems to know that there's a problem there, because he complains that he's always dropping off.
Well, that could account for the problem with the bowel as well.
It could account for a problem with the bowel, and you think, gosh, suddenly you see there are these ordinary guys who have to pretend to be the ruler of the world, and they're dosing themselves with opium, and they're high half the time. They must be, or falling asleep, which is what Marcus complains about.
I mean,
it's bodies. You get really close to their bodies.
Bodies, yeah. Completely fascinating.
Look at Commodus's tonsils, actually. Galen is very good at diagnosing Commodus's tonsillitis.
What do you do? I mean, and did he, presumably tonsillectomy wasn't an option and...
He does piles. Galen is very good at piles. He's very proud of that. I don't know if he does tonsillectomy. But I think, honey and rosewater works a treat.
What's not to like about that? So, another thing that if anyone here did classical civilization or classics in any form, you might well have read, as I did as a teenager, Pliny's letters to Trajan, correspondence with Trajan, which seemed staggeringly boring at the time, if I'm absolutely honest. It's very bureaucratic letters from this very kind of lickspittle provincial governor of Bithynia and Pontus, which is sort of above the Black Sea, and asking Trajan, some really essentially very bureaucratic questions about, could I institute a fire brigade? What do I do about these odd Christian sect? And actually, of course, the full maturity of time, it's obviously deeply fascinating, but always very hard to square this very functional, extremely bureaucratic correspondence with this sort of with the sort of showers of rose petals and the kind of the reputation for luxury, cruelty, insanity, etc. that the emperors carry with them. So, can you give us a sense of how this empire must have, it must have functioned in a very complex way between the figure of the emperor and this very widely dispersed empire. But extraordinary to imagine that an emperor was having that level of correspondence about minutiae with every single provincial governor. So how on earth did it work?
Well, I'm trying a little bit to bring the slightly boring side of being an emperor back in, because you're right to say that what we notice is the luxury, the extravagant dining, you name it. That is certainly what Roman writers talk about. They fantasize as much as we fantasize about, who we would sleep with if we could sleep with anyone in the world, what we would eat if we could eat anything in the world. But they also talk about, and we tend not to notice this so much, is the absolute mountain of paperwork that these guys did, and sometimes got into trouble for it. Julius Caesar and Marcus Aurelius get ticked off because they take their letters to go through to the horse races. And the people get really annoyed because they say, that is not taking popular entertainment seriously. You're doing your paperwork.
Well, imagine if the Prime Minister took a red box to Wembley Stadium at the World Cup or whatever.
Or even if William was caught texting, in the middle of
Wimbledon.
Wimbledon. Oh, God. Well, it's just the same kind of, exactly the same sort of thing. But there's a sense that we've just turned a blind eye to what is an empire of writing and correspondence and signing things off, all over the place. I think it's quite interesting I told you just now the anecdote about the Emperor Domitian. What did he like doing in his spare time? Killing flies with his stylus. What was his stylus actually used for? It was used for doing the admin. It was his pen. And, I tried to put back the idea that it's not just luxury, it's not just, eating on silk and rose petals. The emperor's brand is about receiving letters, replying to letters, reading and writing. And if you keep your eyes open now, in the ancient writers themselves, you find the emperors are always there with their pen. There's a horrible and chilling anecdote about the Emperor Hadrian, which is important in all kinds of ways, but also puts the pen center stage, because Hadrian apparently got very angry with a slave on one occasion and stabbed his eye with his stylus. And then, because it's Hadrian, he feels very bad after a couple of hours and calls the slave back and says, you ask for anything. I will give you anything. I feel so bad. What do you want? And the slave says, I want my eye back, please. Told, actually, in quite an interesting way in Roman anecdotage to kind of...
Where does it appear, that story?
It's in the Historia Augusta. It's in a set of biographies of... No, is it Galen? It might actually, and now I think I'm wrong. Galen has a short section of famous pen injuries. That's right, sorry. And you can tell what kind of guy Galen was, can't you? And I think, actually I'm wrong. I think that's where it comes from. Right? So you see that the pen, the idea that the emperor is at his desk, is as important as all the other things that we imagine him to be doing. Now, in part, this must be a massive illusion, I think. And you mentioned the letters between Pliny, who's the governor in what is now the north coast of Turkey, and Trajan. Pliny is writing repeatedly, saying as governor to the emperor, what should I do about this? Please could you send out a surveyor? The Bath building in Prusa is falling down. What am I going to do about it? What's striking about that is that on the usual methods of transport that would carry these letters, it could well have been 3 months each way for the letter to get from Pliny to Trajan and then the answer to get back. And you think at a certain level, this is a kind of superstructure, which is, well, probably Pliny's covering his back. He's constantly reporting in, but he can't really be taking any notice of what the emperor is saying, because the emperor's reply would have arrived after he'd had to do something. And you kind of suspect that Pliny is hoping that the emperor will retrospectively tell him to do what he's already done, you know? And I mean, the other thing, of course, you don't know is quite who's doing all the writing, because, you know, I've just, you know, told the story of, you know, emperors and their pens, and there's quite a lot of evidence of emperors looking at their correspondence, doing it. But if you start to think about, you know, not just letters from governors, but begging letters from people who've, you know, got troubles anywhere in the empire, they all come to the emperor. And there has to be a massive secretariat in which no doubt the emperor is signing off. But I don't think he's writing the whole time. And it's just like now, you know, if we write to the Prime Minister, we would be naive to think that the letter that came back, if we got a reply, was written by Rishi Sunak. You know, it wasn't. You know, when we read an article by him, you know, the Prime Minister has written has written an article in the Telegraph. No, he hasn't. He's read it over when somebody else has written it, hasn't he? You know?
Yes, I'm afraid he has, yeah. I can personally reveal that you're correct.
And the Roman emperor must be the same. You know, it must be that there's too much correspondence.
Yeah. Okay, here's another thing that we think we know about emperors. In fact, we do know about emperors, is that it's a very unstable system at the point of handover. Like, you know, emperors often do not die in their beds. There are violent ends. There is a struggle for succession. Yeah. That is where this actually, you know, as we've described, surprisingly long-lasting system is very, very unstable, which always made me wonder why anyone would want to do it.
No. It's the worst job in the world. I mean, you're absolutely right. There's a complete tension between the resilience of the system. I mean, and effectively, you know, despite the fact we'd like to find some freedom fighters somewhere, effectively there's no sign of any opposition to one-man rule, you know, after, well, perhaps 40 CE.
Right, there's kind of sentimental nostalgia about, I mean, like in Tacitus, for example, right, isn't there, about the good old days, and a sort of residual, sort of aristocratic sense of we've lost out here. Yeah. But isn't part of the success of it also that Augustus and co keep the structures of democracy intact? Yeah. They just take the power out of them, something that perhaps we see in our own age happen.
You can put that pejoratively or not, right? I mean, it's always been a problem about quite how hypocritical Augustus was. Because you're right to say that there is a revolution between the so-called democracy of the Republic and one-man rule, but actually, at the same time, all the old office holding goes on. People are still made consuls. They're chosen by the emperor. They're not elected. They go to the Senate. The Senate still passes laws. It does things. And, you know, the question has always been, was Augustus just trying to pull the wool over people's eyes? Well, if he was, the aristocracy was damn stupid not to see who was boss. No, they were under any illusions who was boss. I think that what he did, and maybe this is close to what you're saying about us, he provided a language of power in which the new power structure was still talked about in the language of the old. Yeah. You know, so he becomes consul. He takes on these offices. And I think that, I mean, you can see that as very self-serving, which it obviously is, but you can also see it as a way in which he was reformulating the old to make a revolutionary new order. And most senators, most of the Roman elite, they knew exactly what the game was. They were not, they were not taken in by Augustus giving them honor. They knew they had no power. Tacitus himself is actually, he's nostalgic in a way for the old guard. He's also deeply, deeply despising of one of the few dissidents that there are around, who are always dissidents against a particular emperor, not against the system. And he thinks that, the Senate who are opposed to Domitian, for example, they're a bit of a load of kind of hopeless, no hopeless.
All the really noble people are actually in, they're Boudica and Caracalla, and they're characters outside.
Yeah.
As far as Tacitus is concerned.
Yeah, and in some ways, although I think that there's a tendency for people to think, oh, there is no interesting political thought going on in the Roman Empire. There's loads of interesting political thought. And what someone like Tacitus is doing in looking at how power now operates is he's seeing, hey, look, slavery is very important as a kind of absolute exploitative tool, but a cultural tool as well in Rome. Tacitus is constantly saying, who's the slave around here? And how do you know who the slave is? And are we in a world where actually the people who are the most posh are also the most subservient? And he's very keen when Nero sends a freed slave to see what's going on in Britain. Around the time of the rebellion of Boudica. And according to Tacitus's report, I have no clue whether it's true, when this guy arrives amongst the northern barbarians, they laugh at him, right? They think, oh, who the hell's this? All come up. He's a slave, pardon me. Tacitus says, they still knew what freedom was. We don't. And there is a sense that they're constantly examining the idea of what it is to be powerful, what it is to be free, what it is to be close to the centers of power.
It's constantly fascinating to me the extent to which Augustus laid down a kind of playbook for authoritarianism. And one of the key things is claiming that you're restoring something traditional.
Make America great again would be one way of doing it. Augustus was make Rome great again. And the name Augustus is interesting, because I said, he only takes the name Augustus. Let's put him back, horrible little man. He only takes the name Augustus some years into his rule. He'd previously been Octavian. He's trying to look for a name which sounds good. Well, Augustus, as well as giving us the name of the month August, it's very North Korean. It means revered one, right? Now, we now think of the Emperor Augustus. It's a made-up name. And it is Kim Il-jong. It means literally, oh, revered one. And the fact that becomes normalized, so that every emperor ever after Augustus takes the name Augustus in his long lineup of titles. They're all saying, revered one. This is not a democracy. Democracies are not run by people called revered one, right? It's a basic rule of political game. I
wonder if we could look at the slide of Septimius Severus and family, because going back to this thought about the tricky. The sort of tension point of this system is inheritance and is changeover of power and is succession. It is the great question of succession. This is a very, this puts this, could you talk about this incredible image?
Succession is really important, you're right. Just to give a tiny bit of background, the point about the Roman Empire, and it's something that in some ways Augustus doesn't solve. He never has. He has a system for the army, he has a system for the Senate. He doesn't have a system for handing on power. And Rome never had a system of primogeniture, and that is what we're used to in monarchs, in some sense. Primogeniture has its disadvantages, because you end up with any old person on the throne as long as they were the firstborn, right? And sometimes they're hopelessly inappropriate. So the Roman system, where it might be useful to be the eldest son, but it didn't determine anything, was quite good because it gave you more choice about getting a better person on the throne next. The trouble is, it made succession fought out every single time. You know, we know that even if the Prince of Wales, and I'm not saying he is, even if the Prince of Wales is an idiot, he's going to be the next king. And that's it. And that's a done deal. You never have that done deal in Rome. And so succession from the very beginning of the empire, of the one-man rule style empire to the end, is always fought out. Now, it is nicely illustrated here, because this is the Emperor Septimius Severus, ruling at the end of the 2nd, beginning of the 3rd century CE. His origin is in North Africa. His mother is probably Libyan, almost certainly Libyan. His father probably of Italian descent. Exactly his ethnicity is something which is an unsolved problem. He was married to a woman here called Julia Domna, who's a Syrian princess.
And you can always tell which one she is in any statue, because she's got this sort of judge's wig hairdo.
Yes. She's always got that hairdo. She's always got a wig, you know, so look at her and you'll be able to impress your friends and relations in any museum by saying, that's Julia Domna. Yeah. You know, absolutely fine, right? But here we've got the question of succession. And underneath are their 2 children. On the right, there's the Emperor Caracalla, and on the left, with his face blotted out, is the short-ruling Emperor Gaeta. This is, by the way, a very rare painting of the imperial family. It clearly came from Egypt. Its origins on the modern antique market is a bit mysterious, but this was certainly one of what would once have been thousands of paintings of the Roman emperor, this one preserved in the sands of Egypt. So you got Caracalla and Gaeta, and
who are the sibling children of Julia Domna and Septimius Severus.
That's right. And to start with, as was not uncommon, they ruled together. And we often think about Roman one-man rule. It's quite often not one-man rule. Quite often they're sharing it. But they quickly quarrel. And Caracalla, who has been written up as a dreadful thug, whether he was or not, I'm not certain, starts to get the upper hand. They have to kind of turn the palace into a couple of semis because they can't bear living together. So they put a wall down the middle to kind of have, sort of to divide the palace into 2 halves. They share the front door, but then they go off in different ways. And pretty soon, Caracalla decides to get rid of Gaeta. He does it while Gaeta in the palace is clinging to his mum's knee, and in what is probably the most poignant or most pathetic last words in the whole of Roman imperial history, Gaeta dies shouting out, "Mummy, mummy, I'm being killed," right? Which is kind of... but here you see, in a sense, what then happens. Because this painting, after the fall of Gaeta and the murder of Gaeta, this painting was then defaced to remove all traces of Gaeta's features. And Roman history and Roman imperial history goes through that cycle, not as colourfully as in this case, time and time again, with the eradication of the person that you don't want to remember. It's a kind of absolutely massive case of history being written by the winners.
And I think it puts our own kind of contemporary battles over public sculpture and statues into a kind of very interesting relief. Well, relief is a kind of, I didn't mean a pun there, but because this often involves, just as here, physical defacing, removal, remaking of statuary.
Yeah.
So this idea we have that statues are made to last forever was not at all what the Romans thought.
And Roman emperors were much more imaginative than we are. I mean, they do this simple defacement, and plenty of portraits of Roman emperors ended up in the Tiber. I have no doubt about that. The guy falls and he's chucked in the river.
Colston style.
Colston style. I mean, Colston has got a history going back 2,000 years. But they don't just do that. And I think one of the most interesting things they do is one emperor has got a new statue of an emperor who's, oh God, he's just died or just been murdered. So what do? Well, the easiest thing to do is to get your chisel out and recut the face of the statue to make it look like the features of the new guy on the throne. Right? Now, there are many reasons for that. Economy being one. You're a community in, let's say, Turkey, modern Turkey, and you've just shelled out shed loads of money for a statue of Hadrian. And oh my God, the bugger's just gone and died on you. And so you recut him, to make him the next guy on the throne. And I think that's true. I think for me, when I was thinking about how to do the book, it was also quite a nice image. Because the other thing it says is, look, emperors are much the same, aren't they? If you want to change one emperor into the next emperor, just get your chisel out, make the hair a bit different, recut the nose, hey presto, you've got the new emperor. And when I was kind of looking to, as it were, sustain my confidence in my own argument that basically emperors are much more similar than they are different. Of course they're different, and just like British monarchs are different, but basically they're doing the same job with the same staff, in the same place, the same resources. It was the idea that it was so easy to change one emperor into the next that made me think, yeah, that is the right lines to be arguing on. And although I'm not a great fan of Marcus Aurelius, I have to say, although he is in the bestsellers list this week, I tell you, still 2,000 years later, and Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, still bestsellers, right?
Banalities.
Banalities always win, right. When I was reading his Meditations, I came across a bit that I'd never noticed before. He does reflect quite interestingly on the position of being an emperor from time to time. At one point, he is reflecting on his predecessors. And he says basically, and he looked back, he said, they're all the same, really. Same play, just a different cast. And I think, in a sense, if that book is about anything, it's about the play. It's what play are these guys playing? It's not, who's the better actor. It's what's the play.
And about the emperor as a performance.
As a performer. And we knock Nero because, as Romans did, what did he do? He went and performed on stage, right? What was so shocking about that, actually, was that he was revealing the truth that we all know, which is that people in power are in some ways play actors, and this is what they were.
It's a brilliant moment to ask for the house lights to come on and to take some questions from the room and from the world, but I can't see anybody, so house lights would be great. While you guys in the room are considering your next move, I'm going to ask a couple of questions that were pre-submitted, and I've been saving this whole topic of women. I've been saving the topic of women because there were some really great questions from Guardian readers. So I really like this one from Nigel, who asked, in the Roman world, women such as Boudica and Cleopatra presented an alternative model of leadership. Could this have ever happened in Rome? Which is actually, I think, a really quite complicated and interesting question about.
It's terrible.
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, one thing you're going to have to recognise, I think, is that Boudica and Cleopatra were partly invented by Roman writers in order to present a model of what female power might be like if it was untrammelled, right? So they're not saying, "Cool, she's a bit of a role model for our girls." That Boudica, she was being despised. But I think that there really is an important women point in all this, and it is, I think, true at a certain level to say that some women, under one-man rule in Rome, some women had more power than any women in Rome had ever had before. And they have it by the power of proximity, right? If you're living in a world now where power and the decisions that are taken that are important are taken behind closed doors, not in public any longer. Things are not debated in the forum. Might be debated a bit in the Senate, but not in the forum. What you also know is that the people who are close to the emperor, behind those closed doors, have considerably more power than you do if you're not sharing the emperor's bed or being the emperor's masseurs, for that matter. And so there is a sense that women really do have access. Some women have access to the person who makes the decisions. But there's also a sense, and these alternatives are impossible to unpick, that it is always easy to blame the women who are close to the emperor for the decisions that the emperor takes. Augustus's wife, Livia, is supposed to have poisoned every potential heir to the throne that Augustus identified until finally she could get her own son by a previous marriage, Tiberius, on the throne. Now, that may be true or it may not be true, but I think that the Romans are no different from us in often using the women who are close to the men in power as a way of, well, it's a blame the woman scene. I mean, you didn't have to read much of what was happening in the COVID inquiry this week.
I mean, my God, that was
to see what happened to, Carrie Johnson. I mean, I've got no idea what her relationship or power was or is, but I know damn certain it's driven in part by exactly the same ideas of how do we explain this? How do we let the men off the hook here? We blame the woman, so we blame Livia, we blame Carrie, we blame Sherry Blair, we blame Julia Domner, we blame Nancy Reagan. And I think the trouble is that it's impossible from the outside to unpick the story.
It's impossible to do it in relation to 2020 if you've got Simon Case WhatsApping colleagues saying it's really Carrie Johnson who's in charge. And that's, was she?
I don't know. I mean, and
seems unlikely.
Had the Romans had WhatsApp, the courtiers would have been WhatsApping each other to say, it's Livia who's in charge. God, and she doesn't understand a thing, And it's such a mirror of that.
Yes, let's go to this first question. Thank you so much.
Hi, Eleanor. Thank you very much for being here. Two questions, one serious, one very much not. The serious one is, are there any lessons learned, positive lessons learned, that you think we can take from the emperors of Rome into the present day? And the very much non-serious question, which I have a friend who's listening in and wants to know the answer, do you ever get mistaken for Mary Berry?
Let me start with the non-serious one. The answer to that is yes. And
she's a very good baker, I will say that.
I'd really love to do a telly programme where Mary Berry cooked Roman dishes and we call it The Two Marys. Be good, wouldn't it?
You heard this pitch first here.
Yeah. terms of positive things, I find that quite hard, but I think that I find hugely helpful analytical tools there, which I don't know whether you call them positive or negative, but I think the one thing that by the time I came to the end of the book, what I saw more than anything was that the Roman Empire, okay, it survived by force, it survived by some brilliant strategizing on the part of Augustus and so forth. It also survived by the collaboration of everybody else in the Roman world, or most people in the Roman world. And that it's very convenient for us to think of these regimes, these autocratic regimes, as surviving, through judicial murder, the secret police, or whatever. And I'm sure that was partly the case in Rome, partly the case, and I know it's partly the case today. But I kind of thought, look, these guys were not challenged as a group. They were challenged individually, but the system was not challenged because actually everybody, most people, kept their heads down and went along with it. And we always, we do imagine, if I was living under an autocracy, I would put my head above the parapet and I wouldn't stand for this. I think the message of many regimes, but the Roman one is an easy one to take. The message is that people go along with it, and that regimes like this, I think they're probably not as bad as us. It'd be hard to be as bad as the Roman Empire is sometimes painted, but I think it was a despicable and awful regime, nonetheless. It survives because people let it survive. They collaborate, or they don't say they're collaborators, they cooperate, they're working from within, They're only objecting at home to each other, and people don't put their heads above the parapet. And this was at least Russia. 200 years of no heads going above the parapet, apart from some very inefficient ones.
By the way, online audience, you can still submit your questions. But is the microphone with somebody right now, or could it be? Yes, over here. Brilliant, thank you.
Hi. I just wanted to ask whether you thought any Roman emperors either made any rumours or anecdotes up about themselves, and have you got any examples of this?
Well, in some ways, they were absolutely dramatically good at self-presentation, right? Absolutely dramatically. And I think that that starts with Augustus. I don't quite know how it works in the rumour mill, but Augustus's kind of final act, really, was to write and inscribe outside his tomb, or have inscribed on bronze pillars outside his tomb, his own account of what I did. It's called Res Gestae. It's what I did. And it is the most self-serving account that you could possibly imagine.
No mention of the murders of the senators.
The murders, his less than honourable behaviour.
He's supposed to have gouged people's eyes out at some point.
On one occasion, in the Civil War, before he became the revered one, of course. It is a brilliant transformation. He's supposed to have gouged one of his enemies' eyes out with his bare hands, right? So he manages, it is, I don't think it's not really rumour, but it is a real self-positioning as a senior father of his country, putting everything, giving everything a positive spin. It was much beloved by Mussolini, who, in fact, when he recreated one of Augustus's monuments, one of the most famous monuments Augustus put up in the city, the Ara Pacis, Mussolini sponsored a new museum to house it, and he had Augustus's "What I Did" inscribed all over the base of the platform that held up the new museum. And even when the museum was replaced at the beginning of the 21st century, taking down the fascist top and putting a new pavilion, they didn't get rid of Augustus's "what I did" from the side. So Augustus actually wrote his own account so successfully into our story that we even now don't get rid of it. It's not defaced. Somebody doesn't come along and says, what about the war crimes, please? It is there, honoured. Extraordinary.
I just want to come back to because we did have a clutch of really interesting questions about women. As I say, I was saving up the women for this section. Was it completely unthinkable that there could be an empress in her own right? I mean, after all, there were examples of women holding power in other parts of the ancient world contemporaneously, obviously Cleopatra, obviously Boudica. So is there something absolutely inherent to the Roman system that disallowed this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Roman power is defined as male power, and you know that Boudica and Cleopatra are bad things because they're women who are trying to exercise power. They are by definition not Roman. And I think you see that in all kinds of sort of almost unspoken, unthought out assumptions that Romans have, and you can see it in the Latin language, about what power is. And I think one obvious case of that would be the word virtus. It obviously gives us our word virtue, and sort of in part, our own sense of virtue is actually somewhere there in the Latin virtus. But the key is that what virtus means is the quality of being a vir, a man. It is, virtue in Rome is essentially, it's a man thing. And that's what, virtus means. Have you got the man thing? Have you got virtus? And when you're living in a world like that, I think that the only way you see female power, and to some extent we are still the inheritors of this, not to a huge extent, but to some extent, you can only see female power as abnormal, right? So if you talk about women's virtues, that's a difficult thing to do in Latin.
By the way, that was a question from Nina, thank you very much, which I failed to attribute at the time. Is the microphone in the room with somebody as we speak? Yeah, or could be in that direction, could it? If you send the microphone over there, I'll take another question from our online audience, actually. John asks a nice question. How would Hadrian's relationship with Antinous have been viewed at the time? Did it impact his reign? So this is Hadrian's intense love affair with a young man who was commemorated in sculpture very, very widely. Like, we know what this guy looked like, and he was obviously a huge part of Hadrian's life.
Yeah. Hadrian's young boyfriend Antinous is, of all the imperial family, the most statues survive of Augustus. There's several hundreds of those. After that, Hadrian, and next, Antinous. He's the third most commemorated member of the wider imperial family. He died tragically on a boat on holiday on the Nile, right, with Hadrian. And it was kind of big, did he fall or was he pushed, kind of debate about that ever after. I think that
Hadrian's wife was on the boat too,
Hadrian's wife, you are right. I was glossing over this rather interestingly blended family that Hadrian had. And you're right to make it explicit. And I think what's interesting is that, by and large, there would be very little popular disquiet about Hadrian having a younger boyfriend or being unfaithful to his wife. I mean, most Romans would think it would be very odd to be faithful to your wife. That would be the weirdo thing to be, not to be unfaithful. And within the sexual norms of ancient Rome, for an older man to have a relationship with a younger man of inferior status was absolutely standard. What does seem to have unseated people who observed this was the fact that Hadrian went so bananas about commemorating him. That what Hadrian's problem was not, in the eyes of the Roman world, so far as we can tell, it's not having a relationship with Antinous. It was the fact that he literally covered the Roman world with his statues. He made him a god, and he named towns after him, right? Etc., etc. And interestingly, when you see that talked about, it is what is happening to Hadrian there is he's showing womanly grief. His grief is excessive. Excessive grief is a womanly characteristic, not a manly characteristic. So in a sense, he's undoing his own virtus by going so over the top in his excessive grief for Antinous. So I think there would be, you don't find any kind of issue about the sexual relationship as such. It's the reaction to the death that's the problem.
Fascinating, thank you. Thank you, John, for asking that question. I think the microphone is with someone. If you do go ahead.
So, good evening. My question is about the foundation of the empire. So we know that the Republic was under strain by 80 BC, but do you think that it was due purely to the rotten Republic or to individuals such as Sulla and Pompey?
I think that in some ways the individuals are a symptom of the rottenness. I think they're also a symptom of, and as I hinted earlier, I think they're a symptom that Rome has bitten off more than it can chew, and it becomes extremely vulnerable to all kinds of crises which can be seized upon and are seized upon by individuals who want to and are able to put things right. So I think there's a structural problem which goes beyond the rottenness of the state or the nastiness of the individuals. There is a structural fault line as soon as Rome has got so much territory which it claims it needs to control. I think other historians would add in, I think rightly, that there is also an issue, as the Romans themselves saw, about a vast influx of wealth. Because you're getting these guys who are not only taking more political power than other people, but they have enormous resources because of the profits that come from the empire to them personally. They have enormous resources with which to do it. So there's one guy in the late Republic, as I'm sure you know, a guy called Crassus, who comes to a very nasty end in a campaign in the East.
Sorry, I shouldn't laugh.
Nasty end, he's decapitated by the Parthians, and his head ends up being used as a prop in the performance of Euripides' play, The Bacchae, in which one of the main characters is beheaded, right? Okay, sorry. So that deals with Crassus. But why I was mentioning Crassus was that one of his slogans was supposed to be, you can't count anybody rich if they can't raise their own army. And so you can see that the idea that armies are private, which might have been all right in the 5th century BC when no one had any cash, but the idea that armies are private and there are these guys with so much money that they can they can actually get their own armies, I think is all part of a nexus which is a downward spiral. Romans saw that in moral terms, absolutely moral terms, that we think of the Romans as great big imperialists, and of course some of them were. At the same time, they thought that the empire was the beginning of the, gaining a land empire was the beginning of the end of Roman virtue. So that while they are celebrating their military triumphs, or while some of them are celebrating their military triumphs, others are saying, this is the end of what Rome stands for. We have too much. So I think it's all tied up together.
So fascinating, because so much of what we think about the Roman Empire, like the decline of the Roman Empire, is already what they were thinking about themselves.
Yeah.
Because they had some brilliant writers among them.
Yeah, and we're very,
thinkers.
I think, kind of mean to the Romans, really. I mean, they did some absolutely despicable things. I would never, ever want to set foot in ancient Rome. I think it'd be absolutely ghastly. But they were some of the best analysts of their own failures and successes that there have been. They were not all simply jingoistic material imperialists.
I've got one final question, because that's all we're going to have time for, and it's from online. And I'm going to just sort of merge two questions from Don and from Eleanor. Do you think any of these guys were actually admirable? Would you like to meet any of them? If so, which ones?
That's always tricky. I mean, it is always tricky. I mean, one answer is, I think they're all awful, actually. So I would be curious to be a fly on the wall. I think, where would I choose to be a fly on the wall? Well, I'm afraid would have to be Elagabalus's dinner, wouldn't it? I'd really like to see it. But I have no emotional affect for them, but I don't actually have emotional affect for any Romans, I don't think. People sometimes say to me, God, you spent all your life working on Romans. You must really love the Romans. And you think, no, I don't. In fact, I hate them, actually. But I do think they're extremely interesting. So that, a life spent thinking about them and thinking about what they wrote and why they did what they did is, I feel privileged and happy to have spent it. But would I want to meet any of them? No, I would only take a trip to ancient Rome if it were a guaranteed day return, I think.
Full set of antibiotics. Well, thank you so much, Mary, honestly, and thank you, everyone online, everybody in the room, for your questions and for your presence, for your attention. And just to say again that Mary, there are books for sale. Some of them are pre-signed, but Mary will be signing books if you want her to write a short poem or dedicate the book to a beloved friend.
I won't be composing a poem on the spot. It was a fine Roman habit, but not one that I've inherited.
Oh, shame. I just want to ask you to join me, please, in thanking Mary for her wonderful words about these truly awful men that she hates so much. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you.